Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into the pretty complex world of the American Mafia.
Yeah, it's quite a topic.
We've got some great material here, especially this comprehensive document,
hmm
americanmafia.pdf. It really lays out the history, the structure, all the activities.
It's a solid overview, definitely.
And our goal today, for you listening, is to help you get a strong handle on this shadowy organization, its origins, what it actually does, how it's put together,
Right.
without getting totally bogged down. Think of it as your express route to being, well, pretty well informed about the mob.
Exactly. We're aiming for clarity, for context. I mean, the American Mafia, it pops up everywhere in culture, right? Movies, TV, often romanticized.
For sure.
But the reality is this really multi-layered story. It involves immigration, crime, this sort of pursuit of power. We want to unpack the crucial bits and trace how it's changed over time.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning then. When we talk about the American Mafia, what exactly is that? Seems like there are a few different names floating around.
That's a good place to kick things off. You hear American Mafia, yeah, Italian American Mafia, sometimes just the Mafia or the mob.
Right.
What's interesting, though, is that members themselves often call it Cosa Nostra,
Cosa Nostra.
which means our thing, or maybe this thing of ours. And then the government, more officially, they tend to say La Cosa Nostra, or LCN.
Okay, LCN. Got
But
it.
basically, all these terms point to the same, interconnected network of Italian-American organized crime. There are just subtle differences in who's using which term and maybe why.
Hmm.
The key thing to remember is that the American Mafia we're diving into, it has direct roots in the Sicilian Mafia. Actually, the term originally just meant those Sicilian groups operating over here.
So it was kind of imported in a way. Where did it first really start setting up shop here in the U.S.?
It really began to take hold late 19th, early 20th century, often in these pretty impoverished Italian immigrant neighborhoods. Think
Thanks.
cities like New York, places like East Harlem, the Lower East Side, Brooklyn were big, but also Chicago, even New Orleans.
New Orleans. Interesting.
Yeah, that growth was really fueled by these huge waves of immigration, particularly from Sicily and southern Italy. And over time, these Sicilian mafiosi, they sort of merged with other Italian criminal groups already here, plus independent criminals,
Right.
and eventually formed this broader kind of pan-Italian mafia across North America.
And it wasn't purely an American thing, isolated, right? They kept connections back to Italy.
Oh, absolutely. The American Mafia has a long history of working with different Italian organized crime groups. The original Sicilian Mafia, obviously, but also the Camorra from near Naples and the 'Ndrangheta from Calabria.
Mm.
These connections, they've played a role in, various criminal ventures over the years.
Now, looking at the structure, the document keeps mentioning families. Is that just like a metaphor?
No, not really. The family is the absolute fundamental unit. It's the bedrock of how they're organized.
Okay.
But while they use the term family, you have to remember these are criminal outfits, not necessarily blood relatives running things, you
Right.
know? Within these families, there's a definite hierarchy. And the full members, the ones called made men, traditionally they had to be of Italian descent. But they also rely heavily on a network of associates. These guys can be any ethnicity, and they do all sorts of jobs for the family.
So it sounds like a pretty big operation then. Any idea roughly how many people are involved?
Current estimates, they suggest maybe over 3,000 members and associates actively involved. So yeah, quite substantial.
Okay, that gives us a sense of the scale. Now let's dig into how it all started. When do we first see like actual evidence of this kind of thing in the U.S.?
The earliest documented stuff actually goes way back to the late 1860s in New Orleans, believe it or not.
Wow, that early.
Yeah, newspapers back then reported on fights breaking out between different Sicilian gangs. And what's really fascinating is these gangs were often named after the specific Sicilian towns. Their members came from Palermo, Trapani, Messina.
Huh. So those regional loyalties were strong from the start.
Very strong, yeah, even in those early days.
New Orleans, like
Yeah.
most people probably think Northeast, like New York primarily.
And yeah, the influence in the Northeast, especially New York, definitely became more dominant later, in the public eye anyway. But New Orleans was a really early hub. As these Italian crime groups grew across the U.S., they did build up a huge presence in the New York area, spreading out from, smaller neighborhood operations to citywide and eventually national organizations.
The document mentions something called the Black Hand. Was that like an early version of the mafia?
Ah, the Black Hand. That was a really common extortion method in Italian communities around the turn of the 20th century.
Okay.
It sometimes gets confused with the mafia itself, but that's not quite right. The Black Hand was more like a criminal tactic used by lots of smaller independent groups, sending threatening letters, using violence to get money. It wasn't one single mafia organization with that name.
Gotcha. So who was the first sort of identifiable link between the Mafia in Sicily and what was brewing here?
That would likely be Giuseppe Esposito. He's generally seen as the first known mafia member to immigrate here back in the 1880s.
Esposito.
Yeah, quite a story. Fled to New York with 6 other Sicilians after being involved in apparently 11 murders of wealthy landowners back home.
11?
Yeah. He was eventually caught in New Orleans in 1881 and sent back to Italy. Quite the entrance.
No kidding. Okay, what about the early 20th century in New York? Who were the main players then?
Well, in New York City, say from the 1890s up to the 1920s, the Five Points Gang was a major force. Based in Little Italy, Lower East Side, founded by Paolo Vaccarelli, better known as Paul Kelly.
Paul Kelly. Rings a bell.
He's significant because he actually recruited some street kids who later became huge names. Johnny Torrio, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Frankie Yale. They all came up through his gang.
Wow, that's quite a lineup.
Yeah, and they were constantly clashing with Jewish gangs in the same areas. At the same time, you had a really influential mafia family up in East Harlem, and the Neapolitan Camorra was strong over in Brooklyn, so lots going on.
And Chicago wasn't exactly quiet either, according to the source.
Not at all. Chicago's 19th Ward, heavily Italian, and got nicknamed the Bloody 19th.
Oof.
Yeah, because of all the violence from mafia activity, internal fights, vendettas. It was a really unstable time with these groups slowly grabbing more power.
And the document points to a really shocking incident in New Orleans involving the police chief there.
Yes, the murder of Police Superintendent David Hennessy in 1890, that was huge. It's still debated exactly who did it, but it led to a bunch of Italian immigrants being indicted.
Okay.
But then they were acquitted in court, and an angry mob in New Orleans basically stormed the jail and lynched 11 of the defendants.
Lynched them. Good grief.
Yeah, a horrific event. Really highlights the intense anti-Italian prejudice back then and just the brutal environment these early groups were operating in.
That's truly chilling. Okay, let's shift gears to a period I think everyone associates with organized crime's rise. Prohibition. How did that era shape things?
Prohibition, 1919 to 1933. Yeah, that was absolutely a major, major turning point. The 18th Amendment banning alcohol. It basically unintentionally created this massive, incredibly profitable black market.
Right, because people still wanted to drink.
Exactly. Demand stayed super high, so it fostered this environment where crime was almost, tolerated just to get around the law. Interestingly, the murder rate in the U.S. actually jumped significantly during Prohibition, like over 40%.
Wow.
It's a stark example, really. Trying to legislate morality can just fuel these powerful black markets and organized crime, often with, well, more violent results than the thing you were trying to stop.
So the Mafia just saw this huge opportunity and jumped right in.
Precisely. They absolutely capitalized on bootlegging, making, and distributing illegal booze. The profits they were pulling in just dwarfed what they made from their old rackets, like protection or gambling.
Right.
Prohibition basically let these mafia families build up enormous wealth and really cement their power.
Sounds like it created a whole new, super profitable industry just for them.
It pretty much did. And the scale of bootlegging forced them to get more organized. You started seeing distinct roles emerge. Bosses, lawyers, truckers moving the stuff, enforcers dealing with rivals. This period really laid the groundwork for that more structured family system that came later.
And I bet there was fierce competition for controlling this booze trade.
Oh, absolutely intense. Italian mafia families started fighting violently to get total control of these incredibly lucrative operations. They clashed hard with Irish and Jewish gangs who were also fighting for territory, especially in big cities like New York and Chicago.
Yeah.
You had brutal stuff like Frankie Yale's war against the Irish White Hand Gang in New York. And then the infamous massacres in Chicago where Capone's outfit just systematically wiped out the rival North Side Gang, another Irish group.
So it was out of all that chaos and violence that the more modern mafia structures started to take shape.
Exactly right. The early 1930s saw these power struggles continue. You had older traditional bosses like Giuseppe Masseria getting killed off in 31. Then Salvatore Maranzano briefly came out on top, even declared himself boss of all bosses.
Boss of all bosses.
Yeah, and he set up the five families in New York. But his reign didn't last long at all. He was murdered just 6 months later on the orders of a guy who was really on the rise, Charles Lucky Luciano.
Luciano, he seems like such a key figure in that whole transition.
He really was pivotal. Luciano saw that the whole boss of all bosses idea just created instability and resentment. So he basically reshaped the leadership structure.
How so?
In 1931, he was key in establishing the commission.
The commission.
Right, a governing body made up of the bosses from the most powerful families. They'd all have an equal say in settling disputes between families, overseeing national rackets,
Hmm.
moving away from one single absolute ruler. That really brought in an era of more relative peace and much greater stability for the American mafia.
So the commission was basically a way to stop the internal wars that were so damaging and just run things smoother, more profitably.
That's the idea.
Hmm.
By the mid-20th century, you had something like 26 commission-approved mafia families across the U.S. Each generally had its own exclusive territory, except for the 5 families sharing New York City, of course.
Right.
This system made for a much more stable environment for organized crime. Plus, guys like Luciano, unlike the older mustache Pete's, who mostly stuck with other Italians.
Mustache Pete's.
Yeah, the older generation, bosses, often Sicilian-born, sometimes literally had big mustaches. Anyway, Luciano and his guys were much more open to working with other ethnic gangs, especially Jewish-American syndicates. It was all about maximizing profit and reach.
Makes sense.
And they stuck to a strict code of conduct, originally from Sicily, emphasizing hierarchy and omertà, that powerful code of silence.
Okay, so Prohibition ends, but obviously the mafia didn't just disappear.
Mm-hmm.
What did they pivot to keep the money and power flowing?
Yeah, when booze became legal again in 1933, they were smart. They diversified. They kept up the stuff they were already doing: illegal gambling, loan sharking, extortion, protection rackets.
Classics.
Right. But they also strategically pushed into new, often very lucrative areas. Drug trafficking started becoming bigger, fencing stolen goods, and, crucially, labor racketeering, getting control of unions.
Labor unions. That sounds like a really powerful way to get influence.
It was incredibly powerful and profitable. By getting inside major unions, think the Teamsters, the International Longshoremen's Association, the Mafia, got access to legitimate industries. Construction, demolition, waste management, trucking, the waterfronts, the garment industry.
Wow.
They could raid union pension funds, health funds. They could extort businesses by threatening strikes. They could rig bids on contracts. In big cities like New York, it was pretty much understood that major construction projects needed the okay from the 5 families to even happen.
And their influence wasn't just limited to the U.S. mainland, was it? I'm thinking places like Cuba, Las Vegas.
Definitely not. The Mafia had a huge presence in Cuba, especially from the 1930s through the 1950s. They were already involved in exporting Cuban sugar and rum, so they leveraged that. They made big investments in legal casinos, especially after Batista, who was friendly to them, became president in 1952. Some estimates say they owned or had big stakes in like 19 major casinos there. But then the Cuban Revolution happened, Castro banned U.S. investment, and that ended the Mafia's big party in Cuba pretty abruptly.
And Vegas was kind of different, like an open city for the mob.
Yeah, Vegas was sort of unique. It was recognized as an open city where different families from all over could operate and invest. As soon as Nevada legalized gambling, boom, they were right there.
Quick movers.
Very. The casino industry grew incredibly fast. Families from New York, Cleveland, Kansas City, Milwaukee, Chicago, they all had pieces of Vegas casinos. Often used loans from the Teamsters Pension Fund, used frontmen to build and run the places. And a key thing they did was skimming, taking cash right out of the counting rooms before it was officially recorded. Huge amounts of untaxed money flowing back to bosses across the country.
For a long time, it really seems like law enforcement just couldn't get a grip on them. Why was it so tough?
Yeah, historically, they faced surprisingly little effective opposition. Local police often just didn't have the resources or the specialized know-how or even a basic understanding of how to fight such a secretive, organized group. Plus, you had rampant bribery and widespread witness intimidation. That made investigations and prosecutions incredibly difficult.
But eventually, the tide did start to turn. What were some of the key moments when law enforcement really started to fight back effectively?
There were definitely key turning points. The Key Farmer hearings in 1951 were huge for just bringing national public attention to this sinister criminal organization, as they called it, the Mafia.
Right, putting it out there.
Exactly. Even though a lot of mobsters called to testify just clammed up, it was the first time it was discussed so openly, nationally. Then, 1957, the Appalachian Meeting. This was supposed to be a secret summit of top mafia bosses upstate New York, but the state police stumbled onto it.
Oops.
Big whoops for them. It totally exposed the national scale and how connected they all were. That basically forced the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, who'd kind of downplayed it before, to finally admit organized crime was a serious national threat.
And then came Joe Valachi. His testimony seems like it was a real game changer.
Oh, absolutely groundbreaking. 1963, Joe Valachi was the first ever Mafia member to publicly, explicitly say, yes, this organization exists, and spill the beans on everything, the inner workings, the secrets, the rituals, even confirming the name Cosa Nostra.
Wow.
His testimony, televised before Congress, just shattered their whole code of silence, that omerta. It gave the FBI unprecedented insight, let them launch a much more aggressive attack on what they started calling the National Crime Syndicate.
But even with that intel, they needed stronger legal weapons, right? Yeah. That's where AICWCO comes in.
Exactly. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, IACO, became law in 1970, and it turned out to be an incredibly powerful tool.
How did it work differently?
It let prosecutors go after the entire criminal organization, not just individuals for single crimes. It allowed for massive penalties for any acts done as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise. This completely changed the game for prosecuting the mafia. It led to a ton of high-profile convictions through the 80s and 90s.
Cases like John Gotti really stand out.
For sure. Getting Gambino boss John Gotti convicted in 92 was a huge, very public win for law enforcement. And it happened largely because his own underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, flipped.
Right, became an informant.
Yeah. Testified against Gotti in exchange for immunity for his own long list of crimes. That, plus the Witness Protection Program, which gave mobsters a way out of long sentences if they cooperated, it led to way more defections, way more intel for the feds. And as a direct result of all that, the mafia's power, its influence, its reach, it's seen a really significant decline since the 90s.
So what's the situation today? Is the mafia still a major player in the 21st century?
Well, they're definitely still around, still involved in a lot of illegal stuff, but their operations now are mostly concentrated in the Northeast U.S. and the Chicago area.
Okay.
And while you've got lots of other criminal organizations now, many global, the mafia, partly because of those deep-rooted structures we talked about, they still hold significant sway in those specific regions. Law enforcement is still concerned about a potential comeback, though maybe focus shifted a bit after 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, to kind of avoid the spotlight, the modern mafia sometimes outsources certain jobs, maybe the riskier or more visible stuff, to other groups, like motorcycle gangs.
That's clever, in a way. Let's circle back to that family structure for a sec. The source breaks down the different roles pretty well. Can you walk us through the key positions?
Sure, it's a very strict hierarchy, mostly formalized by Maranzano back in 31, and it really mirrors the old Sicilian models. Top dog is the boss, right? Sometimes called the Don, the Godfather, makes all the big decisions, gets a cut of everything the family owns.
Right.
Second in command is the underboss, usually appointed by the boss, often runs the day-to-day stuff, acts as a buffer. Then you have the consigliere, the counselor.
The advisor.
Exactly. An advisor to the boss, often a mediator, a strategic thinker, represents the family with other families sometimes.
Okay, so that's the administration. Then you've got the guys actually doing the work.
Correct. Below them are the capo regimes, also called capos or captains. Each capo runs a crew of soldiers and associates.
A crew?
Yeah. They report up to the administration, manage their crew's activities, could be anything: gambling, loan sharking, extortion, even murder. The soldiers, or soldados, they're the actual inducted MAID members. They do most of the direct criminal work. And traditionally, like we said, full membership meant full Italian descent, though the rules have apparently shifted a bit over time.
And the associates.
Right, last room. Associates aren't official members, but they work for the family. Can be any ethnicity, they do all sorts of tasks, and some can actually hold quite a bit of power within the operation, even without being made.
That's a very defined system, isn't it?
Yeah.
Roles, responsibilities. What about the rituals and customs? The source had some really interesting details there.
Yeah, the initiation ritual to become a made man is pretty significant. Deep roots in Sicilian tradition, influences from old Catholic groups and even Masonic lodges, apparently, usually involves a ceremony. Prick a finger, draw blood, drip it on a picture of a saint. Then they burn the picture in the inductee's hands while they swear an oath of loyalty. That's omerta.
The code of silence.
Absolute silence, total loyalty, zero cooperation with the law, ever. That's the core of it. Other customs, you need leadership approval to kill another made man. That's a big one.
Right.
And the phrase, going to the mattresses, famously from The Godfather, right? But it actually means preparing for a war with another family.
Oh, okay.
There were also those traditions about ancestry for membership, which seem to have changed over time, and weird little rules like historically made members supposedly couldn't have mustache as part of that mustache Pete thing.
No mustaches.
Yeah.
Strange.
And also, homosexuality has generally been seen as incompatible with the traditional mafia code.
It's fascinating how these traditions lasted so long. Now, one of the most surprising things in the material is these times when, paradoxically, parts of the U.S. government actually worked with the mafia. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, these are really strange, kind of ethically murky alliances, really intriguing part of the history. During World War II, U.S. naval intelligence actually made a secret deal with Lucky Luciano while he was in prison.
No way.
Yeah. They wanted his help securing the New York waterfront against potential Axis sabotage, especially after a suspicious fire on the ship SS Normandy. The government basically saw the mafia's control over the docks as a potential asset in wartime.
Pragmatic, I guess.
Highly pragmatic. Then later, Cold War era, the CIA was looking into plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Right.
And these plans reportedly involved recruiting top mafia guys like Sam Giancana, Santo Trafficati Jr. guys who had their own reasons to want Castro gone after he took over their casinos in Cuba.
Enemies of my enemy.
Kind of. And even more recently, though it's still debated, there's testimony suggesting the FBI recruited a Colombo family capo, Gregory Scarpa, a known killer, to help find the bodies of murdered civil rights workers in Mississippi in '64. Using his underworld connections to try and solve this hugely sensitive case.
Wow. That's complicated.
Very. These instances show this weird paradox where national security concerns could sometimes lead to these, well, questionable alliances with criminals. Makes you think about the lines between good and bad in a crisis, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. Very complex. Okay, finally, before we wrap this deep dive, the mafia's impact on pop culture is just undeniable. How's it usually shown in movies, TV, that sort of thing?
Oh, it's been heavily romanticized, sensationalized, fictionalized, all of it. You've got iconic movies like Scarface, the whole Godfather trilogy, the grittiness of Goodfellas.
Absolutely. All exploring that world, often focusing on themes like power, loyalty, family, and always that brutal violence lurking underneath. TV shows, too, like The Gangster Chronicles back in the day, or the huge one, The Sopranos,
Right.
captivated audiences with detailed, sometimes nuanced depictions of mob life, though, varying degrees of realism. And even video games, series like Mafia, Grand Theft Auto, they often feature mafia-type groups. It's just cemented in our popular imagination.
Okay, so just to recap our deep dive here on the American Mafia.
Yeah.
We've traced this journey from, its beginnings in immigrant neighborhoods all the way to becoming this powerful national criminal force. We looked at its complex structure, its strict code, its huge cultural impact.
Right.
We also hit on some really surprising facts like that cooperation with the U.S. government at times, the huge boost Prohibition gave them, the details of their hierarchy, and even how membership rules changed.
Yeah, lots of facets to it.
And ultimately, for you listening, understanding the Mafia story gives you this unique, sometimes unsettling view into American history, into how organized crime works, how law enforcement adapted, and even how much this hidden world influences our culture.
And that understanding really brings up a key question for you to think about. Given how the mafia has adapted over time, and with all these new sophisticated criminal groups emerging now in the 21st century, what does the future of organized crime in America even look like? Will these traditional hierarchical structures like the mafia hold on? Or are we going to see completely new kinds of illicit power structures take over in the coming years? It's definitely something to mull over.